Ja, werkt. Ik hoor het. Why should I?
Just because this doesn't work on mine for now. Now it works. Now. Okay, welcome back everyone. So we're now starting our afternoon session, and our next speaker is Sander Beckers. Sander is a postdoc at the Cluster for Excellence at the University of Tübingen. He works on different aspects of causal modeling, such as causal abstractions and ethical aspects. And previously he was a Humboldt Fellow at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, a postdoc at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Utrecht University, and a research fellow at Cornell, supervised by Joe Halpern. And he obtained his PhD at the University of Leuven, where he was working on actual causation. So welcome, Sander. Looking forward to your talk.
Thanks. Oh. Can I change the view so that it's just the slide rather than the, or is that on this laptop? Okay, thanks. Hi, hope you had a good lunch and that you're ready to devour a bit more causal representation learning. So I must say I feel a bit at unease at this workshop because causal representation learning, well, contains 3 words and there's only one with which I have any familiarity with. So I'm going to try and do my best to still say something that might be relevant to you. And in particular, what I've worked on is causal abstractions. And if I explain what I mean by a causal abstraction, hopefully it will become obvious that there's some connection there to what causal representation learning is trying to achieve. More concretely, I first sketch what my goals are in a very rough manner, and then I'll go into a bit more detail. And to do so, I'll first give you my understanding of causal representation learning. So it's for dummies, because in this field, I consider myself a dummy. And I'll use that idea to somehow then formulate the problem of what causal abstraction learning might amount to. Now, obviously, I can only formulate that problem once I've explained to you what causal abstractions are. So I'll do that as well. And then I'll suggest, but not do much more than suggest, that there's a connection between causal abstraction learning and causal representation learning, and this connection might actually be helpful in making causal representation learning realistic or achievable. All right, so what are the 2 goals that I'll have? First, to simply formulate the problem of causal abstraction learning, which I'd say is perhaps interesting in itself, and I'm only going to formulate it in a very sloppy kind of manner. Nothing that I'm going to say today is extremely precise. Secondly, I'm going to suggest that causal representation learning lies somewhere in between causal abstraction learning and representation learning proper. And looking at it that way might help to understand how we could move in between those 2 extremes to the middle point, which has nice features of both of those problems. A bit more detail. The understanding I have of causal representation learning is that it first takes representation learning, which merely limits itself to learning high-level variables VH from a low-level entangled state space X, and then adds to that the requirement to, on top of learning the endogenous variables VH, also learning the exogenous variables UH, and then a causal model over those variables. That's the goal that we would somehow like to achieve. So it's more ambitious than representation learning proper. And then the idea of causal abstraction learning is It's very similar, except that the low level, what you get there is of a different nature. It's not some entangled, weird state space. It's low-level variables and interventions. So UL, VL, IL, those are going to be triplets that your data is, I'm assuming your data is made up of triplets of that form, where the UL and VL are exogenous and endogenous low-level variables. IL then refers to interventions. So if you give me data saying, if you have this exogenous state at the low level, this endogenous state at the low level, and this intervention, and lots of that, then hopefully I could learn the low-level causal model, and then by applying the ideas behind representation learning, also learn the high-level causal variables and the high-level causal model. And in addition, I would also like it to be the case that the high-level causal model is an abstraction of the low-level causal model. And I'll say a bit more about what that means later. So that's the first goal that I want to give you a sense of. The second goal, so there's some nice features that representation learning has, namely that it's understandable. Namely, we know what it's trying to achieve by way of autoencoders. At least that's how I try to understand it. And so what the problem is that it's trying to solve. It's also realistic, at least maybe that's already being too optimistic, but theoretically it seems realistic. Namely, we have the kind of data that's required to do it. And there are successes in certain use cases where we've achieved it, but it's non-causal. It's purely based on observations. Causal abstraction learning also has some nice features, but some not so nice features. So it's also understandable, I claim, namely, we need to understand what causal abstractions are and then apply the same idea of these autoencoders together so that we can formulate the problem of what it amounts to. But it's not so realistic, at least in the kind of contexts that we're thinking about when we're thinking about causal representation learning. It's not going to be so realistic. I'll make that a bit more precise later on. But it comes down to the fact that the data we would like to have, namely these triplets of the low level, usually don't exist, and the low level causal model is way too complex. Lastly, it's obviously very causal because it's giving us both a low level and a high level causal model. Then causal representation learning itself lies in between, in the sense that it's understandable if we actually see it as a simplification of the problem of causal abstraction learning. Well, not simplification, but at least we don't have all the requirements at the low level. We don't care about the low level, we only care about the high level. So in that sense, it's a bit like causal abstraction learning. But it only becomes realistic if we actually look at it as representation learning, but a bit more complicated. So we want to find an intermediate point between those two perspectives that we can make it still realistic, but also understandable. Now I'll give you my understanding of causal representation learning, which will be the starting point for everything else that I'm going to say afterwards. And I'm getting this understanding from two papers. I'd say the two main overview papers of what causal representation learning is supposed to be about. And each of those actually only have, let's say, one section on causal representation learning. So it's very brief what I'm basing myself on. And even within those papers, what's being said there, I'm already restricting myself to one particular interpretation, namely how to achieve causal representation learning using autoencoders. So that's what I focused on, because I figured, to me, that was already hard enough. And the idea there is that you have, as your data, a whole bunch of low-level, high-dimensional points from an entangled space X, and you would like to learn the high-level disentangled causal model and the variables over which it ranges. How to achieve that? Well, we start with the idea of a standard autoencoder, meaning we just want to find a function, a decoder, which takes you from X to the, from the high level to the low level, and vice versa. You want to have an encoder, which takes you from the low level to the high level. And we somehow want to ensure that if we start at the low level, go to the high level and go back, somehow we end up pretty close to where we started at, right? So we need some kind of distance function to measure the reconstruction loss. And we choose some target alpha, and if we're happy enough that the expected distance, for example, lies underneath that threshold, then we say, okay, success. We somehow constructed a pretty good representation of the low level. That's the standard view, but as we are dealing with causally related variables, those are not independent. And usually these encoders only work if the latent space is independent. So a trick that can kind of be used in this context, which is suggested in this paper, is, well, let's look at the reduced form of a causal model. And why is that? Because at least the exogenous variables at the high level can be assumed to be independent. At least that's an assumption which is quite often made. And so we could try to learn we can try to view the exogenous variables as the latent variables that we're interested in. And a causal model in a very high level view can actually be seen simply as a function from the exogenous variables to the endogenous ones. At least if we're assuming acyclicity, that's the case. So there's some function little mh, which maps exogenous states to endogenous states. And that's the function that we would also like to learn in addition to the variable spaces. So what we essentially do is we plug in an intermediate step into our standard autoencoder framework, namely, rather than going directly from X to the high-level endogenous variables, we're going from X to the high-level exogenous variables, then we're applying the function M to give us the high-level endogenous variables, and then we go back to X. So we basically have a triangle now, whereas before we just went up and down, and we have the same idea. Once we go through this triangle, we want to somehow minimize the reconstruction loss. Okay, so this is what I've now explained is something which you could say, okay, theoretically it seems sensible and presumably this works in some cases. You have more experience with it than I do, but it seems that there exist situations in which it's been used, but this doesn't get us what we wanted to, namely causal representation learning. Why not? Because there's no interventions. Right? We've only focused on the relation between the exogenous variables and the endogenous ones, whereas causal models, they get all their value from thinking about interventions. So how can we make this more precise? Well, a causal model as such, mathematically speaking, can simply be seen as a function, which takes pairs consisting of exogenous states and interventions, and then maps it to an endogenous state, right? If I tell you for each exogenous state and each intervention what the endogenous state is that results from that, I've told you everything that the causal model tells you. And looking at the causal model as a function allows us to actually make explicit this idea that the reduced form autoencoder, as I've called it, simply is the causal model for the empty intervention. So we've now solved the problem for one intervention, namely the empty one, and what causal representation learning would like to do is solve this problem for all interventions. With that understanding of causal representation learning, let me now take a step back and introduce causal abstractions to then, at the end, try to convince you that they're somehow relevant to this problem that we've just set out to solve. To do so first, well, where am I coming from? These are the three papers that I'm basing myself on mostly. Well, there's pretty obvious reasons for that. Two of those I'm an author of, together with Joe Halpern and Frederick Eberhard, and we based ourselves on the first paper mentioned, because that was, I'd say, the first proper attempt at trying to make sense of causal abstraction. And what we try to do in a way tries to generalize or build on that work. So some notation. I've already used some of it without spelling it out, but I hope it was obvious enough. So a causal model consists of endogenous variables, exogenous variables, and structural equations. That's nothing new there. There is one novelty here. We also have an I, which is a set of allowed interventions. So we're not assuming that all interventions are somehow represented in our causal model. We're restricting them. And this is actually an innovation that came from the Rubinstein paper. And it makes a lot of sense in the context of abstractions, because the idea is that at the low level, we can have much more fine-grained interventions, and many of those won't have any sensible high-level representation. So we don't even want to think about those. A very simple example, imagine that the variable A is simply the abstraction of or it abstracts away x1 and x2 by taking its sum. Right? So at the low level, we have x1 and x2, at the high level, we have A. Now, what if I intervene and set x1 to 5? What would that correspond to at the high level? There's no meaningful correspondence. There's no way I can express such a precise intervention at the high level, so that should not be an allowed intervention if I want to really say that the high level model is going to be an abstraction of the entire low level model. I should make explicit which interventions I'm ignoring. Lastly, then, I'm going to focus just on deterministic issues, or at least I'm not going to talk much about probabilities, but obviously they do matter. And to include probabilities, what we do, and it's a pretty standard move, I'd say, is we just add a probability distribution over the exogenous variables. And this then induces a probability distribution over the endogenous variables, which in turn, if you like, then induces new probability distributions for each particular intervention that you look at, because each of those change a causal model and then changes the probability distribution that you would get. Enough with the notation. What are we using it for? So this is a setup of causal abstraction. Imagine that we already have given to us two causal models, ML and MH, where obviously L stands for the low level, H for the high level, and we have some kind of abstraction function tau. Now, this is a crucial part. You might say, oh, you're already starting out with an abstraction function. Yes, but this is an abstraction purely from the state space. It's purely telling you what values of the low level are mapped to, or a mapping between low level values and high level values. There's no causality involved. It's purely static. So it's telling you a mapping from the state space at the low level to the state space at the high level. And there's nothing dynamic going on there. The idea of an abstraction is, okay, if we start out with that, could we now somehow make sense of the entire causal model, also abstracting using the same tau, the same abstraction function? So can we somehow extend this interpretation, this function tau, to the entire causal model? And to make sense of that, recall what I said earlier, a causal model can be seen as a function from this intervention context pair to an endogenous state. And that's a useful way of looking at it in this context as well, because then we can see all the elements that are required. So we already have our mapping from the endogenous state to the endogenous state. So to extend it, we need to also have a mapping from the exogenous state to the exogenous state, right? Low level to high level. And from the interventions, the same thing goes. We want to have a mapping from low level interventions to high level interventions. So that's what we need. And I denote this with tau u is the mapping for the exogenous variables, and omega tau is the mapping for the interventions. So that's somehow something we need to add. And if we have that, then we can make precise the idea that the high-level model abstracts the low-level model. First, I'll give you this diagram because it's easier to digest than the actual formula. There's a typo here. The small u, so the small u, first of all, that refers to values rather than the variables, but it should be ul in the bottom and uh at the top, so that we're referring to different exogenous variables. Now, what you see here is representation of the low level is the bottom line, right? And the ML is a causal model seen as a function, which is applied to low-level contexts U and low-level interventions. W gets value W, right? So intervention is denoted here with an arrow from the right to the left. And that gives you an endogenous state, T equals T. That's the low level. At the high level, the same representation holds. And the arrows to the top, they represent these functions that I was talking about. So tau is a function for the endogenous states, then we have tau u and omega for the other components. Now, to figure out whether or not something is an abstraction, we look at two different paths that bring us from the bottom left corner. So we start out with a low-level context, meaning a low-level exogenous state, and a low-level intervention. We want to move up to the top right corner. Now we can move up there along two different ways. We can say, okay, let's take this particular context and intervention and plug it into the low-level causal model, and this gives us a low-level endogenous state. This low-level endogenous state can then be mapped to the high level by applying tau. So that gives us the value E. We could also return to our starting point, say, no, let's first map the exogenous state to the high-level exogenous state, then map the low-level intervention to the high-level intervention using tau u and omega tau, so that now we're at the high level, and we're going to plug that pair into the high-level causal model, MH, and it will also give us a value E prime. And the idea of an abstraction, or at least the idea of an approximate abstraction, is that they're roughly equal. So abstraction as such means that they're equal. That was the first paper that we focused on, but obviously it's more realistic to demand that they're not equal, but they're pretty close, that they approximate each other. And this holds for each possible context intervention at the low level that we start out with. So that's the the graphical representation. This would be the more correct formal representation, which is saying exactly the same thing. The middle one focuses on the exact case. The bottom one is the approximate case, where, as with the autoencoders, I'm referring here to a distance function that we have, which is trying to assess if we start in these, the bottom left corner, we go up to the top right along these two different routes. Is the distance between these 2 points that we arrive at about the same? And you can play around with, do you care about the expected distance, the worst case distance? You can play around with alpha, like how big can the error be? And we then call it a tau alpha approximation, approximate abstraction, because the tau and alpha are the parameters of interest here. So that's the idea of causal abstraction. But what I've now spelled out is simply, what does it mean, given that I already have my low level and my high level causal model? If you were more empirically minded, this is something else, Kip. If we're more empirically minded, we would like to learn these causal models. So this comes down to the problem of causal abstraction learning. What does that amount to? So here, as our data, I'm imagining that in an ideal setting, what we would have is triplets of low-level contexts, interventions, and endogenous states, which all belong together. So these are all samples from the low-level causal model. And the target is then the high-level representation and the causal models over both, and also our abstraction functions such that the high level is an abstraction of the low level. How do we do that? Well, I'm just going to steal all the ideas that we already came across with causal representation learning. So the first part, to me, this is just a suggestion, but the first part would be pretty straightforward. We need to learn 3 functions. We're just going to learn those separately without even thinking about the fact that this is a causal model. So we're just going to think of, the low-level exogenous variables need to be mapped to high-level exogenous variables. So we're going to learn a decoder and an encoder for that. And again, try to look at the reconstruction laws and see if it's small enough. We're going to do the same for the mapping for the endogenous variables, and for the interventions as well. So those are just 3 separate standard autoencoder problems that we could try to solve. Nothing causal going on yet. The causal constraints come in by then saying, okay, let's say I found these mappings. So first of all, this omega that I found didn't have any constraints as to what form it should take, but this is something I didn't explain yet, but the omega, so the mapping from interventions on the low level to the high level, that comes with a particular abstraction function tau, has a specific form, not anything goes. So we explain in the paper a bit more detail what that means, but not all mappings make sense. So we can ask ourselves, is the omega that we found kind of close enough to the omega that would correspond to this abstraction function? In particular, are they both defined over the same domains? And for the inputs over which they are both defined, do they give approximately the same value? The second constraint, which is the more important one, well, can we find some low-level and high-level causal model such that the high level is a tau alpha approximate abstraction of the low level? So there, the bottom line is simply, again, what I've already showed you before, the definition of an approximate abstraction. So that is essentially the problem of causal abstraction learning. Lastly, I will try to then suggest to you how this might be related to causal representation learning. So I think causal abstraction learning as a goal and as something that we could, if we could do that, is pretty cool. It just seems that in the kind of contexts that people are thinking of when they're thinking about causal representation learning, this is way too much to ask for. Because the assumption is that the low level is some kind of entangled, weird state, whereas I was assuming that the low level was just consisted of clean, separate variables. So that doesn't work. Even if we ignore that, the low level causal model, almost per definition, is going to be too complex. That's why we want to abstract, because the low level is just too hard to work with. So why should we even bother learning it if it was already too complex to start with? Also, I assumed that we had data consisting of low-level interventions together with the states that they correspond with. But that data doesn't seem very realistic. We often don't even have knowledge of what kind of low-level interventions would be realized. Then also a kind of obvious problem, the low-level exogenous variables. Well, we don't observe those, so how could those be part of your data? And then lastly, something I already mentioned in the segment on autoencoders, this only works when the high-level variables are independent. So these are all problems. How can we try to solve them? We should move away from causal abstraction learning towards representation learning. What I'm going to suggest here is just one suggestion, perhaps the most or a very obvious one, but hopefully there are more nuanced suggestions to be made. So first of all, we can forget about the low-level causal model. We don't need it. Secondly, how do we solve the whole intervention problem? Well, perhaps we could have buckets of data such that each bucket, each data set, all comes from a distribution under the same intervention, the same high-level intervention. We don't know which one, but at least we know that all this data belongs to one intervention, this data belongs to another one, and this one belongs to another one. So we can nicely group those. Then for each of these data sets, we could solve the reduced form autoencoder problem that I already outlined before. Then we combine all those solutions by requiring that they somehow are all reduced forms of one high-level causal model. So we require that these solutions are consistent in some way. But since I'm running out of time, I'm not gonna give more detail on that, because essentially what I've just spelled out, that's what I'm saying here in these slides as well. Right, so this is the reduced form what we would have for each I. So for each 8 data set, we solve the reduced form autoencoder, with of course the important caveat that the representations, the variables, the VHs and UHs, they have to be the same for each data set, right? It wouldn't make sense if we're learning different representations. But then the causal part comes in by somehow demanding that these different reduced functions, the MIs, they all can be interpreted as belonging to one causal model, and then we have to find interventions at the high level such that it makes sense. So the CI are also things we're going to have to find, such that the bottom line here is the distance between interpreting or the distance between applying the reduced form function and the causal model function with these learned interventions is quite small. Oh, I'm already at my conclusion, so I'm still hopefully within bounds of my time. So what I try to convince you of or show you is that we can actually define causal abstraction learning in the image of causal representation learning, right? I just used the tricks that we found there. And it might be a helpful way to look at causal representation learning and making it more realistic in a certain way. Thanks, and I'm open for questions.
Thanks, Sander, for the fascinating talk. So we have time for a couple of questions. Maybe I'll go first with a quick one. So you said that at the end of your talk, you said, well, let's just throw away the low-level causal model. We don't need it. So what are then the insights or the key takeaways that causal abstractions can still sort of provide for causal representation learning? Or should we really see it as a separate problem?
Yeah. So that's a very relevant question. So first of all, this is just one suggestion of how causal abstractions might make sense. I've actually, over the past week, thought along very different routes as well. And one possible route would be, you know what, let's not throw away the low level, but let's see it as an intermediate phase. So we go from the entangled, messy, high dimensional state space to the first level at which we want to find a causal model, or at least a partial causal model, but it's still too high dimensional, even though perhaps it is already disentangled. And then afterwards, we're going to work towards a higher level causal model. Particularly if you're thinking of a deep neural network, perhaps each layer of the network might have its own causal model related to that. And then a requirement would be then that each of those causal models, at each of the layers, they're successive abstractions of the previous network. The more simple answer is that it was only through thinking of causal models as these functions and through thinking of the idea of, well, we want to have kind of the idea of the distance, the approximate abstraction idea, that made me realize, oh, this is a way to achieve causal representation learning. So it was more like a source of inspiration. And of course, lastly, it's not to say that there aren't other contexts in which causal abstraction learning might be interesting. It's just that it seems it's not the context in which causal representation learning occurs.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting talk. You can hear me, yeah? Okay. So for me, I'm just wondering about entanglement. Like, to which extent do you think entanglement is important? I mean, like, you show this consistency diagram and it doesn't really require disentanglement, right? Like, I mean, if we verify consistency, is that enough, or do you think it's really important to have disentanglement?
Well, I'm not sure how to make sense of a causal model amongst entangled variables. Like, part of that has to do with abstraction and with the interventions. Like, if you don't have disentanglement, then some interventions won't be meaningful anymore. The entire idea of having separate variables is I can intervene on this one and I don't need to care about this other one at all. If somehow these variables are, referring to the same property in the world, then that no longer holds. But as such, the whole discussion on entanglement and causal variables is something which I'm also have more questions about than answers. So it's yeah.
Hello. Very nice talk. Thank you very much. I have two questions. First, looking at your, your commutative diagram, it feels like there's some category theoretic definition underneath that's either waiting to be found or that motivated your definition. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And then I'm also curious if you have any thoughts on the role of partial observability, either in abstraction or in representation learning. Where, I think in realistic scenarios, it's not just that the low level is entangled, but also that it gives a partial view of the true underlying system. Like if you have a camera image, it might hide occluded objects as well as a lot of things in the world that are not in view. And so, yeah, if you have any thoughts on how to deal with that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to disappoint you because you just brought up two topics or fields that I don't know anything about. So category theory, I know that afterwards this has been given a category theoretic interpretation, but it certainly wasn't my intention because I don't know anything about category theory. So any similarities are purely coincidental. Well, yeah, I guess I just wouldn't have phrased it maybe in those terms. So perhaps implicitly I know something about it then. The second part, well, I don't know anything about learning. So how to deal with partial observability. I'm sure there's other people in this room who would be much better at answering that question than I would. I'm sorry.
Okay, in the interest of time, we need to move on. Let's thank Xander again. Thanks. Okay, so our next speaker is Caroline Uhler, who is joining us remotely. Caroline is a full professor at MIT at the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and at the Institute for Data Systems and Society, and co-director of the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Center at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Caroline has a background in biology and statistics, and her current research focuses on machine learning statistics and computational biology, particularly on causal inference, generative modeling, and applications to genomics. So let's welcome Caroline. Very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. So do you hear me and do you see my slides? Everything good?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, and you see my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Great. So I'm very happy that I'm just talking after Sander, who has already talked about interventions. So it will be continuing on interventions. And so I'll talk a little bit about a causal imputation problem and how that relates maybe to causal representation learning. So I'll start with the motivation, which are two problems that are really fundamental in biology. And here I'm posing them in the single cell biology problem, in the single cell biology setting. So first of all, what is really exciting in biology in general is that you have access to many different data modalities. So that, of course, calls for representation learning kinds of methods. In addition, you have access to a lot of different interventional data. And now by interventions, I don't mean just like 0-1 interventions, say whether a gene is, is just turned off or removed, or whether it is still there, so it's knocked out or not. But even, you can do combinatorial interventions, so I can intervene on multiple nodes at the same time. This would be multiple genes at the same time. It's continuous valued because I can have a drug, and so I can choose the dosage of this drug. So it's a really large space of possible interventions that is in particular infinite if you're thinking of continuous valued interventions. And so here are two very fundamental problems in this setting, and I'm drawing them out with different data modalities because, they can be in any data modality, and I'm drawing them out with different types of interventions. So here with chemical interventions, so these would be drugs, and here with genetic interventions, so where you're really going and say knocking out or overexpressing a particular gene inside your system. Whereas a drug, you don't know what the targets are. You don't have a very good understanding of it. Okay, so here are the two problems. They're both imputation problems or transport problems. I can again frame them in many different ways. So let's say you have a large scale drug screen. Now it is an imaging screen where, you have applied many different drugs and you get to observe, say, single cell measurements. So each one of these is a cell, and you get to see what this applying this drug actually does to these cells. Okay, now here is the fundamental challenge in pharma, of course. I can do these experiments in mice. Can I now from there predict what these same drugs will do in humans? Where, the control is measured in humans, but of course, you need to predict what these other drugs will do in the human context, and then you can go on with actual trials for these different drugs. But this is a large transport problem, but it's also even relevant to think of different disease contexts. Now we had, new disease coming along like COVID-19. You have these large scale drug trials that have already been performed in a different disease context. Can you now predict what these drugs will do when the new, SARS-CoV-2 infected lung epithelial cells, and then therefore prioritize your drugs? Or, just different cell lines, say you're in different cancer contexts. So these are all different questions that are transporting, and I will call this transporting across contexts, right? So these are selection variables. Now I can also ask similar questions about transporting across interventions. And here I'm just drawing it in the setting where my data is now expression data. So this means for every cell, I get a 20,000 dimensional vector where every entry is one gene. So gene 1, gene 2, gene 3, etc. And again, you have a whole lot of data from different interventions, but you'll never be able to do all possible interventions because we have 20,000 genes and you can knock out any combination of genes nowadays. But of course, 20,000 choose 4 plus 20,000 choose 3 plus 20,000 choose 2, etc., is a huge space. You'll never be able to do all these interventions in all the contexts that you care about. So you really care about this problem of from some interventions, be able to predict new interventions that you have not yet seen. Same question can also be asked for drugs, right? That's what drug development is all about. I know the effect of some drugs. Now here, I want to make a new molecule. Can you predict what the effect of this new molecule will be in these contexts? So of course, a lot of talks also here today have been on identifying causal features, which I think is a very, or causal abstractions, which I think is a very important topic. In particular, if we're doing these kinds of types of causal questions with images, right? But to me, and I think there will be a talk on what are desiderata of causal representation learning. So here is one that is critical in the biological context, namely that causal representation learning should also allow to predict the effect of unseen interventions in new contexts. Okay, so you should be able to somehow get a representation of interventions in contexts so that you can fill in these kinds of missing entries here. Okay, so that's what this talk is about. So, but I'll have one slide at least on these more causal abstraction learning or causal feature learning, which is, since we have different data modalities, this is a pretty clear extension to everything that people have already done. Since you have many different data modalities in the biological setting and in many other settings, in fact, we all know all this literature, and here I just have like the fundamental ones, and then there is of course a whole lot of follow-up literature on using invariance to get at causal features, and invariance with respect to interventions, invariance with respect to different contexts. But of course, if you have different data modalities, as we have in the biological setting, well, then invariance with respect to different data modalities can also be used to get at causal features. In particular, and we've heard a lot about autoencoders, we can use different autoencoders in order to map to a shared latent space. Sometimes you actually have the pairing, like when you do it on biobank data sets. So here we had heart MRI data and heart ECG data from some people, you actually have it paired. So you know how to match it in the latent space. But here with cells, you actually can never measure them paired because getting any experiment done is destructive to the cell. So you don't have it paired, but then you can match distributions in the latent space. And so whatever this latent space is, and the features in this latent space should be more causal than whatever you're doing in the original space, right? Because you're removing some of the spurious correlations that are only there in one of the different data modalities. So whatever is invariant to the different data modalities should be more causal than whatever you have when you're doing, anything causal in one of the different data modalities. So multimodal learning can be used as a tool for causal feature discovery, in particular in settings where you do have a lot of different data modalities given to you. And we showed this here, where we're actually able to do much better at genetic association studies, where genes are always causes, of course, of any in this case cardiovascular diseases in the latent space instead of in the joint latent space, instead of doing it in each one of the different data modalities separately. Okay, so that's about, all I want to say about causal feature discovery. Now let's actually really go to this problem of predicting the effect of different interventions, of new interventions or a new context. And so I like this Julia Pearl's causal hierarchy here that I usually show, where, at the bottom we have our standard questions where machine learning has been super successful. We get to these interventional questions, which is actually what I'm going to concentrate on here. And then we have counterfactuals at the top, which is really what basically most of causality is about, where you try to answer questions like, what would have happened had I taken or had I not taken the aspirin? Whereas in the interventions in this level here, which yes, okay, it is at the Neanderthal level in this Julia Pearl's hierarchy, but I think, basically most of the biological questions that we care about are actually in this level here, where you ask questions like, well, what will happen if I take the aspirin? So this is a prediction problem, but it is a causal prediction problem because I'm trying to predict the effect of an intervention, right? It's not like down here where associations are sufficient because, an intervention only has, of course, an effect downstream, but correlation would also be correlated with something upstream, which won't change if you do an intervention downstream. Okay, so these questions are certainly harder maybe than the association questions, but they are prediction questions. So the question is, how do you go about answering these types of questions, and how much of maybe more standard ML methods can you actually use in this kind of setting? So that's what I want to talk about. And so this is my motivating application. Okay, so it connects the two. It connects, transporting across contexts and transporting across interventions, where this is a large-scale drug screen. It's freely available for anyone to play around from the Broad, where here you have a whole lot of interventions. These are drugs and genetic perturbations, and here you have a whole lot of contexts. These are different cancer cell lines. So see it as different cancer disease contexts. And so every dot here is an observation, is actually the experiment was performed, and you get to see the gene expression measurements, but only of 1,000 genes, but that's a lot. So you get a 1,000 dimensional vector. So you should see this as a tensor, where whenever you get an observation, you get a 1,000 dimensional vector. All of the white space is data that is missing, which you would like to be able to fill in, right, to predict what this particular molecule or drug will do in this particular disease context. So the question is, how far do we go as a causal prediction problem, since we're, of course, pretty good at solving prediction problems in general? Okay, so what I want to do is talk about 3 different approaches that we've been working on. One is style transfer, and let me give you the motivation for it. And this is really to go across different contexts mainly, or at least that's where the motivation came from. So what is style transfer? Well, you all are more familiar with it than me, probably. So here I'm thinking of it as, you know, I have these different disease contexts. Say one is cancer and the other one is COVID-19. And I have all these drugs that were applied in the cancer context. So I know, you know, this is the normal state cancer. This is what happens when you apply the drug. Well, now what I would like to be able to do is, you know, predict what happens when you apply this drug in in SARS-CoV-2 infected cells. So predict this outcome here. And then, of course, this then allows you to, you know, to prioritize different drugs. So, well, one idea is maybe, you know, it's motivated by these word-to-vec embeddings, is like, if we can find some embedding where the effect of interventions is aligned across different contexts, well, then we could just take this vector, right, which means applying this drug, and move it over to this new context, and then predict that, you know, what comes out is actually here. Right, and then of course using maybe some autoencoder, etc., of like mapping that back into the gene expression space, and then they're predicting what actually happens when you apply this drug. So that's what is behind style transfer. Now, then I'll also have two different, basically matrix completion approaches. Synthetic control interventions, maybe some of you have heard of, which comes from, you know, actually from the causality domain, more in economics. And I'll talk about it on the next slide, and then I'll look at, you know, deep learning methods for matrix completion in particular when we're going to the neural tangent kernel regime, where we're letting our neural networks go to infinite width. So what I want to do before I go there is actually, you know, just point out this, and of course, you know, there is a lot of literature if you know the underlying causal graph. So by Elias Barnbaum and Julia Pearl, and a long list of papers, I'm only listing two here, that if you know the causal graph, then they have necessary and sufficient conditions for this causal transportability problem. So they know exactly when you can actually, you know, identify a formula that tells you what is going to be the effect of this perturbation in this new context. But you need to know this full underlying causal graph. It's very nice, it's non-parametric. But the disadvantage is, of course, that we never know this causal graph here. Okay, so the question is, how far can we get without actually learning this causal graph? And how do approaches that don't learn the causal graph, like say synthetic interventions and synthetic control, actually relate to these necessary and sufficient conditions? Okay, so let's look at maybe synthetic control and interventions first. This is a really nice line of work here, started by Alberto Abadio from the policy evaluation literature in economics, where what you do is the following, and I'm using always this example here as my, you know, little example. So what you want to do is you want to be able to estimate the average treatment effect. Okay, so I have, you know, here a different particular cell type or cancer type where I have applied a particular drug. Now, in order to estimate what the effect of this drug is, I need to estimate what it would have looked like right without the drug. Now, what you do is, so this is called the target context. Okay, this particular cancer is called the target context. Now, I'll write this target context as some linear combination of donor contexts, where I know what happens if you don't apply a drug. Okay, so I'll write it as a linear combination of some donor contexts. And now I'll just say like, well, you know, since this target is a linear combination of these donors, well, let me just predict that what happens there without the intervention is actually the same linear combination of what happens in these donors without the intervention. Okay, so that's what synthetic control does and has been applied very successfully in many different economics problems. Now, Devavrat Shah and some of his students, postdocs, have extended this to synthetic interventions. Well, so instead of just estimating the effect of what happens without the intervention, you can also estimate the effect of what happens with the intervention. Right? Again, I can do the same if for this particular intervention, you have observed some other disease types with the intervention, with this particular drug, and you can write this particular, you know, cancer as a linear combination of these other cancers, for example, by using, you know, the unperturbed setting. well, then let me just predict that, whatever happens under this intervention is actually the same linear combination of the outcomes with applying this drug in these other disease contexts. That's what synthetic interventions does. Now, you can, of course, generalize this, and this is, of course, motivated by this particular problem where we have a whole lot of interventions. Well, now we also want to do this across interventions, right? If you want to learn what a particular intervention does in this one particular context, well, let me write this intervention as a linear combination of donor interventions, right? And predict that whatever this outcome is here is actually a linear combination of whatever happens in this particular context based on these different interventions. So you just do it the other way around. And we applied this to this data set, right? You just, have a test data set, etc., validation data set, and you just predict what actually happens with all these different drugs and interventions. And it actually seemed to work, better than, previous approaches, at least in this setting. And so then you ask yourself, well, why does it work? And then what is the underlying, and what is nice actually in all these different approaches is that you have testable conditions for when it works, right? So you have what you need is some sort of linearity and some sort of low rank, which you can test in your data, which is really nice, which of course you cannot do with, these kinds of settings here, right? Where you need to know the graph because we don't know the graph. So then we wanted to actually see why could it maybe work in this particular biological setting, and what would be the causal graph that would correspond to these assumptions of linearity and low rank. And here is what it is and why maybe, it makes sense that in this particular biological context, it actually works. So what you need is that, these are all latent variables. These are all genes. So these would be the observed variables. So this is like the gene regulatory network that I don't know, right? These are my latent variables. And you need to have that the intervention only acts on these latent variables. And that then afterwards, all of these edge weights here in your causal graphs, they only depend on the context, so on the cell type. And this is maybe plausible in the biological setting where, what the drug does is it makes, for example, the cell soft, right? And then it does this on all different cell types. But of course, then, depending on what the cell type is, you have different gene regulatory networks, and then the impact will be different. So it might be plausible that, the actions or the interventions only have an impact on the upmost level, and then everything else only depends on the context downstairs. And you can prove that, under this setting, then these synthetic, control interventions, causal imputation methods actually do work. And you can also show that, in fact, Elias and Judea's conditions are not satisfied, but that's fine, right? Because in their setting, it had to hold in the non-parametric setting, whereas here we have linearity assumptions, which mean that we will have more settings where it will actually, where causal transportability will work, as compared to, their stronger assumptions because they make less assumptions. But the nice thing is here that these are testable assumptions in the data set. Okay, so that's synthetic intervention, synthetic control. I ordered the three approaches by how well they do on this particular problem. So this actually does the poorest. And of course, you have a whole lot of linearity, etc. is probably not, and low rank in particular is also not really satisfied. Okay, so let's go on to, this, that I already proposed the idea of how it works with style transfer. I already showed you this picture. Now, in fact, style transfer, so this particular application has been applied. I know this now from in pharma industry a lot. Just standard autoencoders, it doesn't work. And so this is also what we have seen, it doesn't work. But we were quite surprised, and we have, of course, been working a lot on over-parameterization of neural networks, in particular also over-parameterization of autoencoders, where you use these autoencoders where the latent space is larger dimensional than the initial state. And in fact, what you can show for these particular applications, so what you need for it to work is that the effect of the drug, right, which I get to observe because, if you look at this particular drug here, you get to see it in many different disease contexts. So I can check whether the effect of the drug in the latent space is aligned or it's not aligned, right? And only if it's aligned, this approach will work. And so you can show that, in fact, in these over-parameterized autoencoders, so the latent space is larger dimensional than your input space, the effect of these drugs is more aligned. And of course, it's fully over-parameterized. So, reconstruction error is equal to 0. So you're not losing any information. than if you would use your standard autoencoders. And so overparameterization here, we do nowadays also have some proofs, but there's still a lot of open problems and open questions. Overparameterized autoencoders, they do provide somehow more space in order to align or in order for these causal effects to become aligned, although we're not enforcing it, right? This is happening directly without enforcing anything like that. If you have this information, you can of course make your autoencoders better or your latent space better by enforcing this alignment. And it is, I think, exciting to think through a little bit more about how does overparameterization interplay with causality. And this is actually nice because this was also asked as a question in this, paper here that I had at the beginning, right, in the invariant risk minimization paper in the discussion at the end. So this is a clear setting where it does actually. Okay, so this does better. I don't show you the results, but you can believe me, this does a little bit better than the previous approach. Of course, the autoencoder allows you to somehow embed it right into the data in a non-linear way, and then maybe, like moving over causal effects actually works in this latent space. And I'll just end, and I know I don't have really so much time. So now I'll go to matrix completion with infinite width networks, and maybe just give a very high level overview of what this actually means and what is the intuition behind it. So, this is your standard low rank matrix factorization approach. Now, you know how to do this with neural networks, right? When you're doing matrix completion, so you just add your non-linearities here. Now here, what we're proposing to do is you let the width of your network go to infinity, because we've already seen here how overparameterization helps. So that was the motivation for us to do, well, let's look at matrix completion where we let the width actually go to infinity. And in addition, we'll do something that might seem odd right now. So we can write down low rank matrix factorization with the Z matrix here at the end, which is just the identity. And we'll open this up. So we'll have a new Z matrix in here, which we'll be specifying, which is something that is application dependent. So you can see this as a prior based on the application that we're going to apply. Okay. Now, all we're going to do, oops, sorry, I don't know why this happened. All we're going to do is to use the neural tangent kernel. And, probably all of you probably know this, and otherwise, this is very briefly. So if you let your size of the neural network go to infinity, now what is actually nice is that instead of training your neural network, what you can do is just train this linear system here, which is a linearization of your neural network around the initialization. And so now you have this nice linear system. These are actually equivalent as the neural network width goes to infinity. And that then, of course, because it's just this linear system, corresponds to just solving kernel regression with a particular kernel, and the kernel is known, which is known as this neural tangent kernel. Okay, so now what we wanted to do is actually figure out what this neural tangent kernel approach would do to matrix completion. Okay, so that's all. So we're going to do NTK for matrix completion, figure out what the Z matrix actually does. And here is just a theorem written out, but I mean, I think it is pretty easy to just get the intuition is, if you're doing matrix completion, or if you're doing just your standard neural network, then you have a map which goes from X's, whatever your features are, to your outcome variable Y, right? That's the map. Now for matrix completion, you need to, and what your kernel is a kernel between your X's, right? Your data. Now, what you need to figure out is for matrix completion, what is X and what is Y? And it turns out that for matrix completion, it might be intuitive. What is X is just a coordinate, right? It's the coordinate of which entry I want to complete. What is Y is the observation in that coordinate. So that's all that this says, is that, the NTK, what the kernel is that comes out is a kernel among coordinates. And what this says is that, with that Z matrix, what actually the kernel function is just an inner product of your Z columns. So this matrix here that we just added, that is now telling you that it is a prior on, what these columns actually are in your data set. And so if I give you here, just a little bit more intuition. So my columns here, for example, in the drug data set will be different drugs. Okay, so now what this kernel does is, you can have a prior on how similar two drugs are based on how similar, say, they are in molecular structure, how similar two different interventions are. And that's what you're putting in here. So that's a prior that you put in based on other data sets. And that's what it's using in order to do matrix completion. So I'm learning a representation of interventions that tells me how similar two interventions are. And then that's what I'm using in order to do matrix completion in a causal way now, because I added in representations of my interventions. And so that's, in fact, the approach that we have so far that works the best. And, this is the last slide. I'm not going to go through it. But you can, of course, also apply it to all kinds of other things. It's super fast because it just uses the NTK. You can do image completion. You can do all kinds of different problems. It's super flexible because you have the prior that you can define on what is similarity between interventions, between entries of your matrix, and super scalable as well. And so with that, let me end. So I hope I gave a different perspective on what causal representation learning also should allow you to do, namely to predict the effect of unseen interventions in new contexts, and in particular should allow you to get meaningful representations of interventions so that you can predict, right, whether two interventions are similar and then predict what their effect will actually be in a new context. And let me end with that and highlight the two collaborators and, of course, all of my students that have performed all of this amazing work. And thank you all.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that talk. So we do have time for some questions. Yeah.
Caroline, thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I have a quick question. So regarding the interventions, do you have an assumption about the distribution of interventions, or how are they decided? Or is that different when you're suggesting a new one?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So here we don't have a distribution. So because I said prior, right? So then you would think that I have a distribution on it. So it's more like prior information so a feature prior is really how I'm thinking about it, right? So I'm using that I have an encoding of, say, molecular structure, and all I need to know is similarity between them. So that's all I need. I don't have a distribution over my interventions. We also have other work that is really Bayesian, where you have a distribution over interventions, which is particularly important when you do experimental design. Then you need to have something like that, but not in this work.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I have a question about the over-parameterized autoencoder. Is it sparse in some way at the end? Like I'm thinking of the lottery ticket hypothesis, where you have a large neural network and then you can remove a lot of nodes and it still works well, but you need to initialize it as a really big network to start with. Does similar intuition apply here, or do you need all the dimensions?
No, it's actually very different in the sense that, so here we don't have any of these assumptions. All you can show is that the more over-parameterized, it's really just inductive bias of when you're applying gradient descent. So when you can show that the more over-parameterized you make your neural networks, the more constrained you're actually becoming. So it's really self-regularizing itself. And what the self-regularization is that you become more and more attractive at your training examples. So you can prove that as just a consequence of gradient descent with no other assumptions.
Okay, thanks.
No sparsity assumptions, nothing. Yeah. Which is a good property of autoencoders. They should remain close to the training examples when you put in something that is close to a training example. Shouldn't move you far away.
Any other questions? Okay, then let's thank Caroline again.
Thank you.
Okay. Fabio, you there? Yes, excellent.
Yes, just managed to connect.
Okay, so our next speaker is Fabio Massimo Zennaro. Fabio is a postdoc in the machine learning group at the University of Warwick. where he works on machine learning, causality, and abstraction in the group of Professor Theo Damailas. And previously, he did a postdoc at the University of Oslo, working on reinforcement learning, computer security, and uncertainty. And he did his PhD at the University of Manchester, working on unsupervised and information theoretic learning. So we're looking forward to your talk, Fabio. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can I share my screen?
You should be able to.
I had to share my whole screen, so that worked.
Okay.
Not just the slides.
Yeah. I'm not authorized to share. Let's see.
Just a moment, we'll sort it out.
Yeah.
Okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so you should be able to see the slides now. Is that correct?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So sorry for the technical problem. And okay, thanks for the introduction. So what I would like to present today is this problem of defining abstraction between structural causal models. And what I would like to do is try to give a quick overview of the proposals available in the literature, and then suggest a way in which we can try to make sense and relate this definition of abstractions. So first of all, what do we mean by abstraction and why do we care about them? So the idea is that reasoning using abstraction is one of the main ways we use to understand the world, to make sense of the world, and to structure our scientific reasoning and our scientific understanding. The idea is that if we try to understand the system, we can try to describe it or model it at different levels of abstraction. So we can have different degree of detail, of granularity when we model it. The typical examples that we can refer to is one from thermodynamics, where if we consider thermodynamic systems, we can have descriptions that go from one extreme of detail, where maybe we model the system considering the position and the momentum of every particle, to the other extreme, where we have a very coarse-grained description that maybe use just few macro variables, such as pressure, temperature, or volume. So why would we need these different levels of abstractions? The reason is that sometimes maybe a certain type of description may be not accessible, or maybe some other times the description is just not adequate for what we're trying to do, so it doesn't match our objectives or aims. Or more simply, maybe sometimes this sort of description is too computationally expensive. So what we would like to do is to have a way to work with multiple levels of abstractions and be able to shift between them in a reliable way. So the context in which we will consider abstraction is just restricted to structural causal models. So we will imagine having structural causal models described in the same system, but at different level of details. So during this presentation, I will refer to this very simple standard toy example. So these structural causal models are supposed to represent a very simple lung cancer scenario with a different level of abstraction. So here on the left, I depicted what we will consider as our base or low-level model. So this is defined on 3 variables that describe whether a patient is a smoker, whether it developed tar deposit in the lungs, and whether at the end it will have lung cancer or not. For simplicity, so we're working on a very simplified model with just 3 variables. And again, for simplicity, we will just imagine these variables having a binary domain. And on the right side of the slide, I depicted a slightly different version. So a simplified model, which is defined only on 2 variables, S prime and C prime, again, representing whether a patient is a smoker and whether it has developed lung cancer or not. So on the right side, we have what we could consider a simpler, like a high-level model in which we have abstracted away the mediator. So when we want to reason about an abstraction between the model on our left, M, and the model on our right, M prime, we want to ask basically two main questions. First, how do we define formally a map from M to M prime? And the second question, how do we guarantee that these two models are representing the same system and behave in the same way? And this second question is concerned with the problem of defining an abstraction that is consistent. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus only on the first question. So how we can formally define this map between M and M prime. So this question is not so simple, so that the answer is not trivial. And this is due to the fact that, so we are working with SCMs, structural causal models, so with the mathematical objects that carry a lot of information. And this means that if we want to define a map from M to M prime, we could actually define this map between different elements of our two SCMs, M and M prime. So, for instance, we could start defining a map between the variables of M and the variables of M prime. So we could define a functions, for instance, from the set of variables STC to the set of variable S prime or C prime. But we could also define, if we want, a map not on the variables, but on the set of outcomes of the variables. So we could define maps between the outcomes of S, T, and C, and the outcomes of S prime and C prime. Or in a more coarse way, we could define a map between the joint outcomes of the whole model to the joint outcome of the abstracted model. Or if we want to provide a more fine-grained description of abstraction, we may try to consider not just the variables that we have defined, but the whole structure of the model. So we could consider the DAG underlying our two models and try to find a map from the DAG of M to the DAG of M prime. Or finally, since SCMs have also a stochastic aspect, we may ask how we could map the probability distribution over the variables of M to the probability distribution over the variables of M prime. So there are two main important proposals in the literature on how to define this mapping, and I'm going to present very quickly these two proposals. So the first one is based on the definition of a so-called tau omega transformation. And this is basically the definition of a function that goes from the joint outcomes of the base model to the joint outcomes of the abstracted model. This is the original definition that have been proposed for a tau omega abstraction. Successive proposals have refined this definition, adding some properties that are meant to better capture our understanding of abstraction. It's worth noting that when we define this map tau, we also get automatically a mapping between the probability distribution of the base model and the probability distribution in the abstracted model through a push forward of this tau. A second important proposal in the literature is the so-called RA alpha abstraction. So this is a more fine-grained definition. Here, an abstraction is actually defined not as a single function or a single map as before, but actually as a tuple of three elements. So the first one, R, is a subset of variables in our base model. So a subset of the endogenous variables of the base model. A is a surjective function between this subset R and the set of variables in the abstracted model. And finally, alpha is a collection of maps, a collection of surjective functions, actually, going from the outcomes of the variables in R to the outcomes of the variables in our abstracted model. So these are the two prominent proposals of how to define formally an abstraction. So what we can see is that there is a certain degree just in these two proposals on how to define an abstraction. And the fact that there is this degree of freedom and that there are these different answers highlights the fact that underlying there is a different definition or a different understanding of what we mean by abstraction. there is also a different understanding of what should be the constraints that a formal definition of abstraction should satisfy. And similarly, probably there is a different understanding on the situations, on the scenarios in which this idea of abstraction should be enforced. So what we would like to do is to try to understand, to try to suggest a framework through which we could make sense of these different proposals of abstractions, and maybe also offer the possibility of defining or tailoring a definition of abstractions to our needs. So the way we have done this is, first of all, by distinguishing two different layers at which we can define our maps, then highlighting or listing a set of formal properties that we may impose on these maps, and finally describing what sort of abstraction, what forms of abstraction are allowed by such definitions. Okay, so the first thing that we have suggested is to try to understand a definition of SCMs and the layers at which we can define an abstraction as divided in two layers. So we suggested that we can see an SCM as having, first of all, a structural layer. So a layer that is mainly concerned with structural information about our model. So this is concerned about the variables that we have defined, so the nodes of our graph, as well as the edges. And then a second layer that we call distributional layer, which is concerned with the stochastic properties of our model, and so how the probability distributions are defined over it. So what I'm going to do next is to highlight how we can define different formal properties on these two layers. But I'm not going to give for reason of time, I'm not going to discuss in detail how how enforcing these properties affect the type of abstraction that we accept. But of course, in the paper, there is a long discussion about these properties. So the first place at which we could try to define an abstraction between our base model and abstracted model is at the structural layer. And specifically, we could define this map between nodes, so between our variables. So this would be a map, possibly a function, between the set of endogenous variable in the base model and the set of endogenous variables in the abstracted model. On this function, on this map, we could enforce different properties such as functionality, surjectivity, or injectivity. So what's interesting is that in the literature, certain proposals support enforcing some of these properties, while others do not. And the decision of guaranteeing or not guaranteeing one of these properties means that we will allow only certain types of abstraction. Also on the structural layer, we could decide to define a map not just between nodes, not just between variables, but we may try to consider the whole DAG in itself. So we may consider nodes and edges as well. And so we could try to define a map between the two DAGs. And formally, this map may be expressed as a functor between the three categories that are defined by the DAG on M and the DAG on M prime. And similarly to what we have done before, we also try to enforce properties such as functoriality, fullness, or faithfulness. And the last layer that we will consider is, as I said, the distributional layer, where we will define a map F either between the outcomes of individual variables or between the joint outcomes of the variables. And again, on this function, on this map, we can enforce properties such as, again, functionality, surjectivity, and injectivity. So all in all, what we have been doing is trying to define this framework that allow us to see proposals of abstraction in the literature side by side and allows to relate them. But such a framework would allow us to do more than just this. One important contribution that it gives is that it allows us to distinguish different aspects of abstractions that often are conflated when we discuss of abstraction. One example is coarsening. Often coarsening is used as a synonym for abstraction, but we can easily see that coarsening behaves and have different characteristics, whether it's enforced on a distributional layer or on a structural layer. So for instance, on a structural layer, coarsening means a reduction of the observables that we have, while a coarsening on a distributional layer means that the resolution of the observables is reduced. Moreover, such a framework could allow us to understand and define abstraction according to our needs, so tailor the definition of abstraction according to what we think abstraction should mean. Of course, this is just like a preliminary work. So in the paper, there's some of these formal properties that we can enforce on the definition of abstraction are discussed, but there are, of course, other properties that may be interesting discussing at a formal level. And more importantly, it would be interesting and useful to extend this approach to consider properties that are not just formal, but also related with the property of consistency. And so defining how a consistent relation of abstraction may be guaranteed and enforced. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Fabio. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yep.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I just wanted to know, how do you relate your work to the second to last talk by Beckers? And what kind of consistency constraints would you impose on your model?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could have attended the talk, but I was out trying to connect to the workshop, and I just managed to connect like 2 minutes before this talk. So I would actually like to ask if the talk has been recorded.
It has been recorded, so we might be able to share that later.
Yeah, maybe if I can watch it, I would be really happy to discuss about it.
Oh yeah, can you show the reference slide,
right,
please?
Sure.
Any other questions? Okay, then let's thank Fabio again.
Thank you. Thanks.
And we now have a coffee break until 3:45.
Hi, Yiping. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, we are waiting for people to come back from the coffee break. We had an extended coffee break. Sorry, just a second.
Sure. No worries.
I'll just anyhow I have to read some stuff. Anything I can help? No, maybe if you let me check in who's asking questions, what people ask questions, just give me a sign or something. I can also run around. Are we 30 minutes to talk? This talk should be. Yiping, maybe while we are waiting for people to come back, I think people are slowly coming back to the room. You could start sharing your slides.
Okay, sounds good.
And so maybe I will tell you 2 minutes before the talk ends. If you want, I can send you a message on Zoom. All right.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we will start. So welcome back to this last session of the first workshop on causal representation learning. Our next speaker is Yiping Wang. So Yiping is a Master of Mathematics student in the Cheriton School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo. And previously he received a Honours Bachelor of Science from the Department of Computer Science at the University of Victoria. And he received a number of awards and scholarships, namely he's a Vector Scholarship in Artificial Intelligence recipient, a Think Swiss Research Scholarship recipient, and an Ontario Graduate Scholarship recipient. And he's going to talk about causal class activation map for weakly supervised semantic segmentation. Thanks a lot, Yiping. The floor is yours.
Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Yiping Wang, and I'm a master's student at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So first, I have to apologize I couldn't attend this workshop in person because the visa processing time in Canada is just much longer than expected. And also a heads up is that I don't really have a formal training in the topic of causality. So the knowledge about causality I had was just self-learning from the books and the internet. So just feel free to point out my mistakes if I have any during my presentation. So anyways, for today's presentation, I would like to present an application of causality in computer vision using a causality tool, or more specifically, it's the title of this presentation. It's called causal class activation map for weakly supervised semantic segmentation. So semantic segmentation is just a standard or basic computer vision task, which takes an image and output the pixel level predictions. And previously, how people usually do that is, especially in the deep learning area, how people usually do that is it requires a pixel level annotation to train a deep neural network to do segmentation. And such annotation can be really expensive to obtain, as the annotator have to annotate the every pixel to have a specific category. Such annotation is very expensive, especially in the domain of medical images. So what is a weakly supervised semantic segmentation? And this weakly supervised simply meaning the ground truth we have is only the image level labels for the object without any pixel level annotations. And this task is, you can imagine, is significantly harder than the previous pixel level annotated segmentation, as the model have no information about what position the object might be in the images, and let alone generating a mask to separate the objects. A popular pipeline to dealing with this problem is to leverage something called class activation map, as shown in the gray box. So to explain class activation map, it was first proposed in 2016, which is basically a tool to visualize the attention of a classification neural network for a specific class on a specific images. So after we train a classification neural network on a classification dataset, once we have that trained weights, we can obtain a class activation map for a specific class by multiplying the feature maps with the trained classification weights, and you just sum the multiplication results. And this is more like an empirical results rather than theoretically justified. And people just found out this property of the neural network, and people just using that to explain the, explaining the behavior of the deep learning classification model. So the class activation map simply roughly pinpoint the location of the object. For example, in these images, it simply pinpoint the location of the dog, but is also only focusing on the most discriminative regions. For instance, the response of the head of this dog is rather high compared to the body of the dog. So this is basically the problem of class activation map. So back to the popular pipeline. So after we having this class activation map, which you can see from this example, the class activation map only output the head of this bird, which is not really enough to train a accurate segmentation network. So the next step people will do is to refine this class activation map by simply thresholding or using some other intelligent algorithm. And after this expanding part, you would having something called pseudo mask, because this mask we append is not the ground truth, it's rather or fake ground truth. So that's why people call it pseudo mask. And after you have this pseudo mask, the last thing you have to do is simply train your standard semantic segmentation using the image you have and also the pseudo mask to train a semantic segmentation convolutional neural network. So based on this pipeline, intuitively, if we want to improve this segmentation, semantic segmentation model, the first intuition is to improve this class activation map. Imagine if your class activation map suddenly covers all parts of the bird, and after some pre-processing or refinement, the pseudo mask you have will be rather accurate. And eventually your semantic segmentation model will also be accurate because your pseudo mask also were improved. So this is actually the motivation of this this project, is to improve the quality of this of the class activation map. And the way I do it is to trying to using the causality model, which is essentially trying to using something called the frontal adjustment. So in the leftmost figure, it's a structure causal model for this project. The X just simply representing the images, Z representing the tag or the image level label for images, and YZ representing the seed, which is a class activation map for the object in the images. C can be any confounders for causing the cam to be not precise. So the confounder can be roughly anything. In the previous literature, I saw people were claiming confounder can be the context of the images as well. So yeah, basically, but for using frontal adjustment, we really don't have to explicitly estimating the confounders. So that's why frontal adjustment was more useful for in this application. So mathematically, this is the well-known frontal adjustment formula. And the next slide was showing to interpret each term in this formula. So the PZ condition on X is simply the probability for image X to fall into a category of Z. And the PY condition on X and Z is simply the process of computing the class activation map. So the process for computing a class activation map is simply getting images and a class you want to visualize, and you will get the Y, which is a class activation map. So after you have all these things, you simply so this three terms is more explaining how these three terms interact in a classification neural network. And after this, we will have a training pipeline for in this project, which is rather simple. You take in images and you pre-train a classification neural network on a particular data set. And after the classification neural network was trained, you can generate a bunch of class activation map for each classes. For instance, the data set I was using was having aeroplane and bike and sofa and monitor. And after you train a classification neural network, you first compute the class activation map for each images and for each category. And after that, you simply take the sum of the class activation map over all the images. And I just call them something called global cam. So it's basically telling you the general location of the object in a particular images. So this is the pipeline of the training for this project. And in the next slide is some qualitative results. On the left side is some successful cases. So in the first column is the original images, and in the second column is a baseline cam. So basically the original cam without any modification. The third column is the causal class activation map trained after the previous training pipeline. So you can see from the third column, some parts of the image does get enhanced. For instance, this shape has already been enhanced, as well as the bus, as well as the most part of the cat. And also the first column is the pseudo mask generated by the original cam. And the fifth column is the pseudo mask generated by using the causal class activation map. And you can also see the parts of the object were all much more covered more parts of the object, which is a good thing to improve your training of your semantic segmentation model. And on the left side, this sort of behavior also carries, which meaning in the original cam, the bird is already segmented really well, but in the causal cam, it tend to over-segment the object. So basically, this is all the patterns for the failure cases, which basically meaning the object will be over-segmented. And this is mostly the reason causing the results of our model not to stay to the state of art weakly supervised semantic segmentation model. So this is some quantitative results, and I've shown all the up-to-date results, including the CVPR 2022. And for the state of the results, they're rather high for generating the pseudo mask, which outperforming all the others. But for others, but for our implementation, although it's really simple, it outperformed the previous causality tool published in neural information processing in like 2 years ago. Their method was rather interesting and a little bit complicated. And compared to ours, we're simply I don't really have a code implementation code for on this presentation, but if you check my code GitHub code, source code, all the implementation was just one single line in the standard training pipeline, which improved the results by roughly 2% compared to the previous causality work, which almost 2%. So yeah, so basically that's my presentation, and I have to thank the funding source for my graduate study, which include the Vector Institute and the school and the University of Waterloo. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Yiping, for your nice talks. Are there any questions from the audience? Maybe I will start with a question in the Zoom chat. So Chris Imedzwe, I hope I pronounce right, asks, are there some intuitive reasons for the over-segmentation of the causal CAM? Does it have something to do with the segment, the original image, or what is your explanation?
So I don't really have an explanation for that. I think the over-segment problem is just the cause of this training. Oh, actually, I do really have an implementation. So I actually forgot to talk about this part. So let me talk this part first. So for the implementation, all you have to do is to after you're generating the global CAM, and you multiply the logits, the prediction logits from the classification, multiply that logit with a global CAM, and then you just do your regular backprop using a simple loss function. So basically, the implementation is just adding one more line during a standard training of the classification neural network. And therefore, the questions, the reasoning for over-segmentation, I think it's still an open problem for me to explore. But generally, I think it's just the results of multiplying this global CAM. So basically, you can think of that it just enhances the response of all the feature map of the classification neural network to make the value larger, and then you suddenly have more values for all the pixels in the images. That's the only explanation I can offer at this point.
Thank you. There is a question from the audience. So.
Hi, Yiping. Thanks for the talk. I was curious in your front door diagram. Could you explain? I didn't get the intuition for why the CAM wouldn't have the image as a parent.
This one for the image as a parent, meaning
basically a connection from X to Y.
Yes, that's actually a really good question. So when I was having this structure causal model, it was just after reading the book of backdoor adjustment, because the previous work is using backdoor adjustment, and I was reading the textbook, and I saw there's a front-door adjustment. Why not people using that? And I was just trying to shuffle the classification parts into this model, and then I started doing experiment by using this model. And after that, I do realize that this model is probably not really accurate, because there should always be a curvy arrow from the X to Y, because your images is just deciding where the precise location of the object. So that is a really good question, which I should actually bring that up during my presentation. So I think that is more like a thing for me to refine this work. And that's why this work appears to a workshop instead of the actual publication. Yeah. So I really don't have a good answer for your question. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot. I think we will thank our speaker and again and move to the next talk. So thanks a lot, Yiping. So I think our next talk is Bernhard Schölkopf. Bernhard, are you okay? I see you connected. So feel feel free to start sharing your slides. If you.
Okay, thank you.
I will give a brief introduction before. All right, so our next speaker is Bernhard Schölkopf. So Bernhard is a director at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Tübingen since 2001, and he also holds a professorship at ETH Zurich, and he is an Amazon distinguished scholar. Bernhard is interested in machine learning and in causal inference, and he did a lot of very influential work, which is hard to summarize now. He authored a number of books, including Learning with Kernels with Alex Smola, Semi-Supervised Learning with Olivier Chapelle, and Elements of Causal Inference with Jonas Peters and Dominic Jansing. And we are very much looking forward to his talk on Desiderata for causal representations. Thanks, Bernhard.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Can you hear me? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we hear you. We see the slides.
Okay, perfect. So it will be maybe a bit of a non-standard talk, more conceptual and maybe useful for discussion for a workshop. Because now that we've been working on causal representation learning for some years, I thought maybe it's time to actually start trying to define what we actually mean by it and what are the desiderata, what we would like causal representations to satisfy. So I'd like to make a contribution in this direction. And I'll start with a list, and it's a somewhat unstructured list, and I'll come back to that list later and try to see if we can tick off some of the things. So I think many of us have the feeling that causal representation should have something to do with out of distribution generalization, this thing that this IID assumption that has been called, I believe by Zubin, the big lie of machine learning. So we want to get away with that, get away from that. We want, in particular, those systems and those representations to support multi-environment, multitask problems. We want them to be sample efficient because maybe whatever we've learned on one problem, part of it we want to reuse in another problem. We want fast adaptation, transfer, one shot. We want maybe lifelong learning. That's another term that's used there. Of course, we want to support interventions and mental reasoning, thinking, planning, explanation, credit attribution. We want to, so another thing that I think we don't talk about much, but that might be just as important, is something one could call, maybe in leaning on OOD, we could call it OOB, so out of variables, or maybe more accurately, marginal generalization. And this is based on the fact that we actually, if we think about lifelong learning, we're never going to see all the variables. So we'll see some variables, and later we'll see some other variables, etc. And then the question is, how do we put all of this together? And maybe that could be even called the second lie of machine learning, which also connects to the second law of thermodynamics. And it's actually not totally unrelated, that problem. And so I'll say a little bit about that later. And maybe also become a bit more speculative about the big picture in the future. Maybe we want to support something that could be called cultural learning. So much of what we learn as humans is not learned from input-output data, but it's actually learned from instruction and learned from others. And this is culturally transmitted knowledge. And maybe we want to support communication. So that's a long, big wish list. And I mean, I don't have to explain or define to this audience what's a structural causal model. So I'm going to skip over this and maybe just remind ourselves. So this kind of models, there's two ways in which they are coupled to the environment. One is through the noise terms, and causal sufficiency assumption basically says we want the model big enough such that the noise terms become independent. If they were not independent, we would have to make a bigger model. That's the one coupling. The other one is through interventions and shifts. So we have this sort of magic thing coming from outside, changing certain mechanism. That's an intervention, or a shift is also a form of intervention. So while we normally think that the model is big enough that the noise terms are independent, every so often there might be something coming from the outside and changing something in the model, curiously. So that's the coupling to the environment. And and then there's this independent causal mechanisms assumption that much of our work has been based on. And this assumption I'd like to summarize as follows. So first of all, we have the so just from the fact that the noise terms in a structural causal model are independent, we have this nice factorization of the joint distribution into the conditionals, into the causal conditionals. This Markov factorization. But we would like to postulate, in addition to this thing being a product of conditionals of parents given their causes, their direct causes, in addition to this, we would like to postulate that we can independently intervene on these things. So changing one of these guys does not have an effect on the other ones. The other ones will remain invariant. And also, the second is more for an informational criterion. Knowing one of those guys doesn't inform us about any of the other guys. And then related to this, we would like to postulate something that's sometimes called sparse mechanism shift. And that's the assumption. It's an assumption about the real world. It's an assumption that says that if we have a real world system that's described by such a factorization, and if we make a small change, or if we look at now at a related system, then typically a closely related system will only have a few terms that are different. So the change will be sparse in this factorization. And that's crucial that it's in this factorization, because it will not be sparse in other factorizations. And you can think of this assumption as a relaxation of the IID assumption. So we're saying a distribution may change, but it changes in a benign way, in a way that in the causal factorization takes a sparse form. Okay, so other factorizations, like this factorization here, will be a non-causal factorization, will not have this property. It will be different in several respects. One of them is that, of course, we won't be able to intervene on any of those terms. They are not meaningful physical mechanisms. But the other thing is also, if we make an intervention on the things that we can intervene upon, so on those mechanisms, then those interventions will typically have a non-sparse footprint in those terms here. So they might change many or all of them at the same time. So this is the sparse changes is something that's particular about the causal factorization, and that also could give us potentially a learning signal. But before even talking about learning, and I won't talk much about learning algorithms, I would like to point out some interesting implications of these assumptions. The first one is about a problem that we could call the transfer problem. So suppose we have learned a multivariate density P1, and now this density is drifting or changing to some related density in the real world. And now I'm asking, how many variables do we need to observe in this related density? So which kind of marginals of the related density do we have to observe or get samples from to learn the new density? It sounds like a strange question. And of course, the answer is, if we know nothing about what is the change, then all of them. And people have tried to come up with assumptions, and there are all these impossibility theorems about domain adaptations, etc., by people like Scheib and David. So it's this is a hard problem. And the question is, can we make better assumptions, or are there causal assumptions where the answer is less trivial? So suppose we assume that the two densities share a causal graph, and we make the sparse mechanism shift assumption. So you might want to think about this for a second. What is the answer in this case? And the answer is much better here, because in this case, we know that most of the conditionals remain the same. So we would only have to observe the variables that appear in the sparse number of changed conditionals. So that's one observation. And the other one is now about this problem of marginal generalization. Suppose we suppose we have IID samples only from marginals over variable subsets. So we don't see all the variables of our system, but we only ever have joint observations of subsets of those variables. So we get samples from marginals. When can we still learn the overall model? So the overall model with its complex dependency structure. And again, this factorization now comes to the rescue. So one particular interesting case is if the graph is known and if the observations of the marginals are such that each causal conditional, so each of those terms, is completely included in a single marginal. So the causal conditionals are not split over multiple marginals. Then, of course, we can solve that problem. Then we can just estimate those guys and get the overall distribution by taking the product of them. So that's a second aspect in which this factorization helps us. And it's related to something that in probability is called the marginal problem. But I think they usually don't look at it from a causal point of view. And I should say it's also related to a recent paper of Luigi Grisoli et al., where that has a slightly different focus, but that talks about this problem and talks about the relationship between interventional and counterfactual models. How am I doing in time? Yeah. So we've tried to, so I hope this motivates why the independent mechanisms assumption and sparse mechanism shift are useful. Now I want to say a little bit more about this, about the independent mechanism assumption, which is essentially also the basis of sparse mechanism shift. I want to mention we've worked on this for more than 10 years, and we've tried to formalize it in different ways. And I want to give you a bit of the history or some ideas about that formalization. First one was we looked at a particularly simple case of cause-effect models, where we managed to come up with a formalization, a simple formalization, but that already led to an asymmetry between cause and effect that could be used for inference. We've tried to also, so there's this, I've always, when I talked about it, I said, like, knowing this thing doesn't inform the other one. So it's a bit like the shape of one mechanism is independent of the shape of the other one. So it sounds like a strange kind of independence. It's not the same as a, in this way, if I put it like this, it's not the same as a statistical independence. So we've also tried to model it using Kolmogorov complexity. It's basically the idea that the description of one mechanism in terms of bits, the shortest description of that, plus the shortest description of another mechanism. So those things are additive. And if I describe them jointly, I don't save space by jointly compressing them. That's also a form of independence, an algorithmic independence in terms of Kolmogorov complexity. And you can formalize things this way. And you also get a nice theory of graphical models that are not probabilistic, but that use independent bit strings instead of independent noises. And you also get a decomposition, which is similar to this causal factorization. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about this most recent one, where we've tried to connect things to the Definetti theorem. And so this builds on the notion of exchangeability. So here, suppose we have a sequence of random variables that's exchangeable. So that means the order of the random variables doesn't matter. And so exchangeable random variables need not be IID. IID ones are exchangeable, but not vice versa. But the Definetti theorem tells us that we can make them, we can make the exchangeable random variables conditionally IID, given a suitable latent variable theta, so a suitable random variable. And the distribution of that random variable is what we can think of as the prior. So it's sometimes used as a justification of Bayesian inference. So even if you're not Bayesian, if you believe that your data are exchangeable, then it's as if you use a prior. Now, we can, so now let's look at not an exchangeable sequence of single variables, but of pairs of variables, where X causes Y. So that's our model. And what do we mean by this? And we're going to make an assumption that's a formalization of the ICM, the independent causal mechanisms assumption, corresponding to the assumption that X causes Y. So in the case where X causes Y, this version of the ICM assumption says that the direct parents, Xn, and this notation is just the indices 1 through n. So if we are given the direct parents 1 through n, we don't gain additional information about the effects 1 through n by observing a single additional point input xn plus 1. So that means that of the input distribution, this input mechanism doesn't provide information about the conditional, which is the special case of independent causal mechanisms for a two-variable system. And then the theorem says that if under these assumptions and exchangeability, we can represent the joint probability of this sequence of pairs as a mixture of conditionally IID sequences that share an invariant underlying causal factorization that corresponds to X causing Y. So here's the term for X. This is the term for the condition of Y given X. They have independent latent variables. So this is just a product over these latent variables. And so the independence of the mechanisms then turns out to be here to imply an independence of these latent parameters. There's also a multivariate version, which is too complicated for me to write down here. The assumptions are a little complicated, but the theorem is exactly what you would expect. So it gives you this nice invariant Markov factorization with independent terms here. So what's important? And there's also results if you look at the paper about identifiability, but what is important is that if you have exchangeable data, but non-IID data, and these multiple environments corresponding to multiple different values of these latent parameters, then you can actually identify causal structure from data. So this exchangeable non-IID data is actually more valuable than IID data. And of course, this is something we as a community have been working on now for the last more than 10 years, how to use this idea of invariance, etc. So let's move to causal representation learning. So we all know about symbolic AI. Symbolic AI had this weakness that the symbols had to be provided a priori, the rules had to be provided a priori. A great thing about machine learning is that we can learn all this stuff from data, and we learn a representation that preserves statistical information. What we would really like now is to have this benefit, learn representations automatically, but learn them in such a way that they also capture interventions, allow reasoning, etc., and not just preserve statistical information, but preserve some form of structural information. And we have done a number of work on this, but I don't want to talk about any of this, or maybe only very briefly about this today, where we try to come up with methods that either use the independent causal mechanisms principle, use ideas of counterfactuals, use sparse mechanism shift, or use the structure of an acyclic graph to bias deep learning models in the correct direction. And I've put some citations here on the slides, but rather than going into those, because I still see the time is already more advanced than I thought it would be, I want to and maybe this is a nice picture. That's a model.
Bernhard, I think you still have a bit of time.
No, I still need a bit of time because I have a big chunk at the end that's also new. So, but thanks for pointing it out.
Okay.
So this is an example of an interventional generative model where we have nice modes of interventions on different aspects. So I want to now come back to this question of what should be a causal representation. And maybe before doing so, let's just remind ourselves what do we even mean by a statistical representation. And I did not see a clear definition of this. different elements or different aspects that people have talked about. We could say that information, statistical representation of a variable X could be one that preserves information about some other variables. For instance, information about the conditional expectation of the target variable that maybe preserves mutual information and at the same time, a representation should make the information in some sense more accessible. So it could have computational statistical advantages, or a representation space, for instance, could be a Hilbert space. Or sometimes there's also a more subtle point that sometimes it could be advantageous if the representation moves higher order moments into lower orders, into first order, to make them accessible to linear methods. So that's also related to the computational advantages. And there's many examples. One that I've worked on a lot is kernel methods, where the representation is in a Hilbert space. And I'll show you one example how this representation gives us this kind of commutative diagram here. And that's the example of the reproducing kernel Hilbert space means classifier. So there the idea is you have two sets of points. You have a binary classification problem. You have two sets of points. You map them both into the reproducing kernel Hilbert space. And then you define the classifier simply to assign a test point to the class whose mean is closest. So that's really the simplest classifier you can come up with. But it turns out if you write that classifier in the input space, so now I've told you this classifier, go to the Hilbert space, then linear classification. If you write it in the input space, you get to the same results and you get a classifier that basically does 2,000 Windows density estimates in the case where these are normalized entities, and classifies based on that. So it looks very different, but the diagram commutes. And then there's this notion of kernel mean maps, where you map not just individual points, but whole sets of points. And then if you map those sets of points, you can ask what kind of information does this mapping retain. And it turns out if a kernel is strictly positive definite, or if it's more generally characteristic or universal, it retains everything. And what's interesting about this is that in this case, essentially all the information is moved into the first moment, because this is just computing a mean in the reproducing kernel Hilbert space. Now, coming to causal representations, some first thoughts is that we would like to have a representation that leads to this kind of factorization. So we would like to have a mapping that takes our inputs, maps them into variables S, either by just a function or by a conditional that could be conditioned on different things, such that in the S representation, we get this factorization, and the factorization satisfies ICM or sparse mechanism shift, or both. I think another element that would be interesting to think about is that a causal representation could include something that psychologists call affordances of objects. So it could be a representation where alongside with an object, you also represent action possibilities or intervention responses. So it's a bit like if you look at this picture, it's almost like you're already thinking what to do with this thing. You want to press the button when you see it. And so it's something we could maybe in analogy to object-centric representation, we could call them intervention-centric representations. And I think they don't necessarily have to represent a whole complex causal graph, but already here it would seem beneficial to represent that one mode of intervention alongside. But then like the bigger picture is in the end, I think a causal representation could also be a solution to this fundamental problem of epistemology, which is how the world gets into our heads. And just to prime your thinking a little bit in this direction, I would like to briefly read this example to you. It's from a play of Brecht. It's a dialogue between in the TUI Academy. That TUIs are a particular kind of intellectuals that Brecht made up, and they sell their abilities and opinions as a commodity in the marketplace, much like what modern machine learning scientists do. Anyway, so there's this TUI Academy, and the teacher asks, tell us the principal question of philosophy. And then the student says, are the objects of the world outside ourselves, for themselves, independent of ourselves, or are they in ourselves, for ourselves, dependent? And the teacher asked, why does the question remain unresolved? And the student says, well, the Congress, which was supposed to deliver the answer, was held in the monastery on the banks of the Yellow River. The question was formulated thus: is the Yellow River real, or does it exist only in our heads? However, while the Congress was debating, there was a thaw in the mountains, and the Yellow River broke its banks and swept the monastery away, along with all the Congress delegates. So the proof that things are outside us for themselves, independent of ourselves, was never reached. So, so I think this makes an interesting point that maybe one could make in a more structured point. And this is something related to what constructive psychologists have called reality criteria. So we construct a model in our head, but we still have to somehow check it against reality. And there are different criteria for doing so. Some of them could be syntactic. For instance, we could compare different modalities if they're consistent with each other. They could be semantic, for instance, context fit of a perception. Or they could be pragmatic, connecting our constructions to actions. And I think the last one is particularly interesting, and it's related to the example of Brecht. It's a very strong pragmatic thing that killed the philosophers. So I think now connecting also to the picture that I showed before, a causal representation could, for instance, also be one that induces a suitable commutative diagram. It could be a representation that induces a homomorphism that maps the transformation group. So in the case where interventions could be modeled as a transformation group, that's not always the case, but if we like move around objects, for instance, so something that gives us a representation of this group action in terms of transformations in our representation space. And just as an example, I like the example of changes in brightness or changes in light color, etc. So imagine you have a transformation of the world that just changes the brightness of things. Now, you don't want to build a separate sort of object recognizable different brightness objects. You want to use the same one. So you have to have a way inside of your head to factor out these changes or to represent these changes by a corresponding transformation in your head. And it could be a very simple one. It could just be a gain control in the retina or something like this, or more complex, a color constancy algorithm in visual cortex. So you could have such a representation that plays the same role as a different representation in the real world. Of course, it has nothing to do with it. This might be physics of light, and this is something that happens in the retina. It has nothing to do with it, but it has the same, it could have the same algebraic structure and represent this in our heads. So I think this is an interesting direction also to think in the future of causal representations. So where do we stand right now? So this was the Desiderata list that I showed you at the beginning. So I think if we think of the representations as these kind of factorizations, then I think we have interesting answers about these first 5 points. Maybe I don't discuss it in detail now, but we can come back to the discussion now. I think if we learn these kind of systems, it's clear that if mechanisms are shared across different distributions, that will also lead to higher data efficiency. It will lead to sharing of data, pooling of data, etc. If we identify invariant components, etc. And I put a number of references over here. So these independent mechanisms that are robust across multiple tasks, they are good candidates for model components that support this kind of aspects. It's clear that also structural causal models, that's what they're built for. They do support interventions. They, in principle, also allow sort of this mental simulation, etc. I've told you something about how these kind of models with suitable assumptions support this out of variables or this marginal generalization. So learning only from subsets of variables, also in a lifelong learning scenario. I think they are also interesting when it comes to these last questions. So cultural knowledge. What do we learn from our parents? What do we learn in school? I think we don't learn people don't tell us about correlations between things, but they tell us about robust mechanisms. So they tell us about components that are maximally transferable and that we can apply in new scenarios. And I think also for this causal representation that factors a joint distribution into such robust components is a good candidate to provide this kind of knowledge to pass on. And finally, I think there will be two interesting instantiations of causal representations. The one is an instantiation in the field of data science, which we could call a causal digital twin of a complex system. So it consists of decomposing a complex system into mechanisms. And then these mechanisms can be independently represented using a whole set of different tools. It's also related to this marginal problem, because each mechanism only needs data that appears in this mechanism. So some of them could be represented using machine learning, some of them could be represented using simulations. Some of them might be known from experimental studies or analytically known or transferred from other problems because we believe they're invariant. And we can this way build such a complex system without having a single joint observation, which is kind of trivial to model, but for a machine learning person, we usually, when we want to model this, we want joint observations of the whole density. So I think that's a very promising direction, and we currently have a project going on where we try to apply this in a case of COVID vaccine study and policy, rational COVID vaccine policy optimization, where almost all these different things appear. And the second one, of course, is the problem of AI, where we want to build causal world models for intelligent agents, because we'd like to follow Konrad Lohns, who once said that thinking is nothing but acting in an imagined space. So we need representations that support actions to go towards this kind of thinking. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Bernhard, for this very interesting talk, and I hope that the banks of the Yellow River don't break in Eindhoven before we understand what causal representations are, and all that are swept away. Okay, is there any questions from the audience?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask if you could expand a bit on the cultural learning aspect that you mentioned, because I've heard before Uhler also hinting at a similar research direction, but it's not very clear for me how causality could contribute to this. So is it because agents could communicate a bit better or have a shared language, or they could have some imitation process between themselves? What could happen here with causality?
Yeah. So I think first of all, I recommend there's a fascinating book by a guy called Joseph Henrich. It's called The Secret of Our Success: What Makes Humans So Successful and So Smart. And interesting thing about humans is we basically, so a very large part of the stuff that we learn, we actually learn from other humans and through cultural appropriation and cultural learning. So we don't just learn from input-output data or by directly imitating, but we learn from others. And that's probably the reason why humans are the only species that can live anywhere on this planet. So we are surprisingly adaptive in the kind of things that we can do and the kind of places that we can live in. And this is because of cultural learning. And the most striking example is if you have these expeditions where people, when they took a big ship, I don't know, and would try to go to the Northeast Passage or drive north, then their ship gets frozen and they have a lot of guns and a lot of cans, and nevertheless, after a year they die. But there are Eskimos living nearby who have been living there for centuries. So what makes us successful in a place is to have the right kind of cultural knowledge. And these explorers didn't have that, and the Eskimos had it. So it's clear that for our intelligence, standard machine learning is not the full story, and maybe the other components is actually more important. But then the question is, how do you have to, in which form do you have to pass on this knowledge? Into what does it have to be converted such that it can be passed on as cultural knowledge? And then one hypothesis that I've put forward today, and it's of course not the whole story, one hypothesis could be that it has to be maximally robust knowledge. So you want knowledge that works as robustly as possible, and then that could be causal knowledge. So I think right now this is a sort of a high level analogy, and it's a wide open field, and it hasn't really been formalized yet.
And do you see this being more useful for artificial agents to communicate with each other, or also between artificial and human agents? What do you think is more important?
Sorry, say again. So the communication between artificial intelligence and each other, or between AI and humans? You're asking which of those two?
Which of those? Do you think causality is relevant for both of these, or for one in particular?
Well, so maybe first for the communication. So I talked about this problem of how does the world get into our head? Assuming there's a world outside, how does it get into our head, and why could it have anything to do with the world outside? So the next level of that problem is, what about the world in my head and the world in your head? Why do they have anything to do with each other? It's also this kind of coupling problem, and maybe structurally not fundamentally different. So I think in that sense, it could also have something to do with some kind of representation, some kind of homomorphism that preserves structure. And therefore, maybe also with causal representations, I can't tell whether that's going to be what is going to be more important between humans or between agents. I mean, I abstractly, I would think of a human as an intelligence agent, and I would try to first start studying the problem abstractly as a mathematical problem. But I think it's a fascinating problem, and it's not totally out of reach. I mean, historically, philosophical problems have been formalized and have gradually left the field of philosophy. And I think it could be that we are now at a point where even this problem of epistemology will gradually be mathematized and formalized, and we will make progress on it. So I think that's not impossible, and that makes it particularly exciting to be in this field right now, I think.
Thank you.
We are slightly over time. Maybe there's time for one brief question, if anybody has. Okay. No. Okay, maybe in the interest of time, I think we will thank Bernhard for the second.
Thank you.
All right. Our next speaker is Gemma Moran, and I should say, before introducing her, we should really thank her for accommodating our schedule and all our sort of unpredicted errors in the problems in the beginning of the day and move to the afternoon. Last speaker. So first, thanks a lot to Gemma for this. So then introducing her, Gemma is a postdoc at the Columbia Data Science Institute, working with David Bly. Previously, she received her PhD in statistics from the University of Pennsylvania, advised by Edward George and Veronika Rokova. Her research develops flexible Bayesian models for analyzing high-dimensional data, and her research interests include developing identifiable and interpretable deep generative models, and in particular variational autoencoders, and improved tools for Bayesian model criticism. And I leave the floor to Gemma. Gemma, looking forward to your talk.
Hello? Is that working? Yes. Great. Thank you to the organizers for putting together such a fantastic workshop. I'm excited to be here and talk about some of our recent work in identifiable representation learning. So as we've heard today, identifiability is a key ingredient in causal representation learning. Without identifiability, we have many different representations that fit the data equally well, that are observationally equivalent, and we can't tell these representations apart. So if we pick the wrong representation, this has implications for downstream tasks like generalization and transfer learning and developing hypotheses. So ideally, we want to find some causal factors in the world. So I'm going to talk today about a method we developed for identifiable and interpretable representation learning. And we can kind of view this as sort of the first step in causal representation learning in the framework that Ayapo talked about this morning in terms of first doing feature learning and then doing causal discovery. So this talk, I'm mostly going to focus on that original feature learning from this high-dimensional data in an identifiable way. How do I do it? Next slide. Sorry. Okay, great, thanks. So before I begin, I'd first like to thank my collaborators in this work, Danya Shrida, Yixing Wang, and my postdoc advisor, Dave Bly. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is the data I'm going to talk about today is structured data, like what we might find in genomics, in text data, in ratings data. So where every sample, we have a set of features that are sort of consistent across those samples. So in genomics data, for example, we might have cells and the expressions of genes for each of these cells. And we might want to understand what genes act in a coordinated fashion, and so which may be driven by some underlying biological factor, for example. In text data, we have a bag of words. We might think that they are correlated in certain topics. And in ratings data, we might think that movies are collected together in certain genres, for example. So we want to extract these meaningful representations from the data. As we heard from Bernhard's talk, there are many different desiderata that can come under the term meaningful for representations. And I'm going to talk about 3 particular desiderata. We may eventually want more desiderata, but this is what I'm going to focus on in our work. So firstly, we want our representations to be flexible. So we want them to be able to capture nonlinear associations in the data. And ideally, we'd want to interpret them in some way. So the way I'm going to define interpretability here is that we can understand what parts of the original data depend on what latent factors of variation. And so that can give us an idea of what each of the latent factors are representing. And finally, we want identifiability. So we want there to be like a global optimum so that there is some true representation. We don't have that indeterminacy among our representations. So I'll first do a quick literature review of representation learning within these categories. So the first category that I'll place in the interpretable and identifiable section is linear methods. So they're interpretable in that we can inspect what of the original data features depend on which factors of variation. And under certain assumptions, such methods are identifiable. So in non-negative matrix factorization and topic models, if we have certain like anchor or sparsity assumptions, then they're identifiable. And there's been some recent work in linear factor analysis as well, proving identifiability under certain assumptions. So in the flexible and identifiable sphere, we have a number of weakly supervised methods where auxiliary information is available, such as like auxiliary labels or augmentations of our data or certain temporal information on interventions. Or we could constrain the function class in some way. So as we've heard about independent mechanisms and sparse structure today, and that's going to be the route that we'll follow as well. In the interpretable and flexible section, there's a method for group factor analysis where the data is naturally grouped that you can inspect what the features depend on, but there was no identifiability results there. And so we see our method as sort of fitting into this interpretable, identifiable, and flexible framework. And how we do that is we introduce sparsity into the decoder of our representation learning method. So in the mapping from our underlying factors to our observed data. And as I'll show, this leads to flexible, interpretable, and identifiable representations. So as a roadmap for the rest of my talk, I'll first give more intuition behind identifiability and how sparsity really helps us here. I'll then introduce our method, the sparse VAE, and talk about some experimental results. So I'll first just look at the linear factor analysis model, the classical linear factor analysis model, to provide some intuition for what goes wrong when we don't have identifiability. So in this model, we have our observed data X, where N is the number of samples, so it could be cells, for example, and G is the number of features, so it could be genes. And we want to decompose our matrix into a set of latent factors Z and some loadings matrix or mapping B. Now, the problem of identifiability here is that we can introduce any rotation matrix that we like and retain the same marginal distribution on our x's. So equivalent solution to this problem is instead of Z and B is Z times P and NB times P. And this is problematic because these representations will have very different meanings. So if you change one column of this ZP matrix, then a whole range of different changes are going to occur in the original data. Whereas if you change one column of this Z matrix up here, we can see from the sparsity here that only one of these, or a small set of the columns in X is going to change. So yeah, if we pick the wrong representation, then this can lead to problems in many downstream tasks, such as exploratory data analysis, generalization, and so on. So this is even worse in the nonlinear case, where we have our latent factors Z, they are passed through some neural network or some flexible function to reproduce the data. So we could equivalently write Z as instead some function H inverse of Z, and then compose F with H to reconstruct our original data. So this is observationally equivalent, but whether we choose Z or H inverse of Z have very different implications for our downstream tasks and actually learning like our true representations. So how can sparsity help in this setting? So in our work, we build off the work of Bing et al., who considered the linear case. And they prove that these latent factors Z are identifiable if for every dimension of Z, there are at least 2 anchor features. And so what do I mean by an anchor feature? Is a feature of the original data, a column of the original data matrix that depends only on that column of the Z matrix. So what we can think of here is that we've observed a proxy of our latent Z1 in the data matrix. So we've observed Z1 plus some noise. So if we have such features for each of our latent dimensions of Z, then we can identify the true factors of variation. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about how do we generalize these ideas to the nonlinear representation learning setting. So what we do for our model is we introduce a masking matrix W. So here we have the usual deep generative model where we have Z, our latent factors, but now we're masking them with some feature-dependent W to reproduce the original data. So what this means is that each coordinate of our data depends on a different set of the underlying factors. So here we have xij depends on these first dimensions of the latent representation, whereas another coordinate of your data, so another feature, so it could be different genes or words or movies, depends on a different set of the latent factors of variation. So what we can see is that this W matrix here plays a similar role to the loadings matrix in the linear case, where it selects which of our latent factors are important to reconstruct each of the different features. So another way to look at this model is that we're breaking the connections, or some of the connections between our latent factors and our observed data. So in a usual deep generative model, every element of x, or every coordinate of x, depends on every coordinate of z, whereas in the sparse deep generative model, we have here x1 depends only on z1, and so on. So this is great because it's flexible and it's interpretable in a way in which we can look at what factors these features depend on, and so interpret them in that way. So for instance, if x1, if x were movies, so if x1 was alien and x2 was aliens, then we know that Z1 encodes some kind of sci-fi factor or sci-fi genre. Okay, so what about identifiability? So as we've discussed today, the definition of identifiability is if we have any two parameterizations that have equal likelihood, then they must be equal. So we're going to relax this somewhat up to coordinate-wise identifiability and permutation identifiability. So essentially what we only care about in the setting is not mixing these dimensions of our latent factors. We want to avoid this setting where, we've just kind of broken the meaning of our latent factors. So this is our Desiderata for identifiability. And we prove that our factors are identifiable under the following assumptions. So again, we use this anchor feature assumption, where for each of our underlying factors, there are at least two features that depend only on that factor and have the same mapping. So these anchor features don't need to be known in advance as well. So this is our assumption as it is. I think that it can be relaxed a little bit in terms of having this the exact same mapping, up to, like, they can have a similar mapping, but that's in future work. Our second assumption is on essentially the scale of the neural network. So we assume that if you perturb a factor, then the anchor feature is going to be perturbed more than a non-anchor feature. And so that sort of makes sense. If an anchor feature depends only on one factor of variation, it's going to move more than a feature that depends on other factors that are being held fixed at that point. And so we show that this is satisfied by neural networks with ReLU activations and independent weights. It would be interesting to generalize this to trained weights instead of independent, but that's our theory here. And we also have an assumption on the covariance of the underlying factors of variation. So we don't require that the factors be independent, but we have this condition that like the individual variance of any factor has to be greater than its covariance with the other factors. And so to think about what this means, essentially, we can't have things be completely confounded. Like, if you only ever see a picture of a cow on grass, then you can't really distinguish that a cow is different from grass. You need to see enough variation in a cow being on different backgrounds to be able to call that a factor of its own. Okay, so how do we estimate our model? So we have the following priors on our parameters. So in particular, we have a spike and slab lasso prior on our mask W. And so this is a prior that a priori, each element of W is drawn from either a spike and is forced to be 0, or a slab and is allowed to be large. And so this kind of encodes our inductive bias of we want to learn anchor features, so we're going to put this sparsity inducing prior to get at these anchor features. And then we have a normal prior on Z and normal likelihood on X, but we look at other likelihoods as well. And we fit this model with the variational EM algorithm with the usual updates for the variational approximation for the latent variables and EM steps for the spike and slab lasso parameters. Okay, so now I'll talk about some of our experimental results and consider different sets of experiments. So the first set of experiments concerns recovering the true factors of variation. So how well does our method do? The next concerns prediction or out of sample prediction. And then we consider domain adaptation. So what happens if the test and trained data have different distributions? And finally, does the sparse VAE find meaningful factors of variation or interpretable factors of variation? Okay, so I'll compare a number of methods, including the VAE, which is not identifiable nor sparse, the beta VAE, and variational sparse coding, which places sparsity-inducing priors on the factor Z, whereas we place sparsity-inducing or sparsity assumption on the decoding of our model. So in the first experiment, we look at the following generative model where we have 2 factors of variation and 7 dimensions in our observed data X. So we have 3 anchor features for our Z1, 3 for Z2, and we have some interaction term in X7. So this is the mapping. So we have that X is linear in the first or the first 2 coordinates of X are linear in Z1 and quadratic for X3. Similarly, X4 and X5 are linear in Z2, and then X6 is sinusoidal, and then we have an interaction term. So the true W matrix here looks like this. And we can see that the sparse VAE does a good job at recovering both the latent factors and preserving this mapping between the latent factors and the observed data. However, if you look at what a VAE does, it learns one of the factors fairly well, but then mixes the coordinates of the other factors, so it can't recover this mapping. And we can inspect the W matrix learned by the sparse VAE and see that it matches well with the true W matrix. And I'll note here as well that we didn't actually assume that we knew that there were 2 factors of variation. We started with 5. And the nice thing about the method is that as W is sparse, it can just have columns of zeros and just decide not to use a number of coordinates of Z and thereby have a data-driven way to choose the number of dimension of the factors. So with this same experiment, we look at the MSE and the DCI disentanglement score as we increase the correlation of the factors. We can see that the MSE is fairly consistent, but the DCI disentanglement decreases as the correlation increases, as it's harder to disentangle these factors. But consistently, the sparse VAE does better than either VAE or variational sparse coding. And it turned out the VAE did better than the beta VAE in this case, and so we did not check that. Okay, so now we'll look at prediction. So we first considered a movie lens data set, which consists of ratings by different users. So we had 100,000 users and 300 movies. We can see the sparse VAE does the best in held out log loss, recall, and normalized discounted cumulative gain, which is like a ranked version of recall. We also looked at a period data set, which is a bag of word counts in different paper abstracts. with 10,000 papers and 500 words, and again, performing the best at out-of-sample reconstruction. We next looked at a domain adaptation experiment where we took the peer-read data set and we constructed a synthetic version of it. So what we did was have the latent factors retain the same distribution across the training and test data set for half of them, and then half of them have different distributions across the train and test data. And so the idea behind this experiment was if you're mixing the dimensions of your latent factors, then you're going to do poorly in the test data, whereas if you successfully isolate the correct dimensions of your factors, you're going to do well on the set of factors that have the same mapping, but not do as well with the ones that have a different mapping, but do better at least than not finding it well. And across different levels of correlation among the latent factors, this is our difficulty level, we find we have the best log loss across these methods. So finally, we'll look at interpretability. So in the movie lens data set, we found meaningful factors via this matrix W, which shows which features depend on which latent factors. So for one of the factors, it contained a bunch of sci-fi movies. For another, it contained a bunch of Pixar movies. And the final, or another one contained a bunch of action adventure or maybe Harrison Ford movies, among a number of other interpretable genres. And we also found that certain movies were anchors for those topics, so allowed for even better interpretation. We next looked at a single-cell RNA molecule count data set. So this is counts of molecules in mouse cortex cells from different regions of the brain. And so a goal here is to see, do we have representations that can predict what region of the mouse cortex the cell came from, as like a measure of like how much information is this retaining, like are we finding these like meaningful factors. So most of the methods did fairly well in predicting the cell label. Here, our method performs the best, but we could also look at the genes that were selected in this W matrix and found that they're enriched for a number of biological processes. So it's finding some kind of meaningful signal in these representations as well. So in future work, I'd like to think about how these anchor assumptions can apply in image data. So we require each feature to sort of have a consistent meaning across samples. So for instance, like gene 1 is gene 1 for all of your samples, whereas pixel 1 can represent something completely different or, you know, need a different mapping across different images because, you know, it's image data. So how can we, you know, learn consistent features and retain identifiability? So with that, we developed the Sparse VE. It's flexible, interpretable, and identifiable. And we have a paper on archive under submission. And yeah, so as I said, this is sort of the feature learning part of the causal representation problem. And so also extending this to be used in causal discovery methods would be very interesting. And, you know, thinking about what are the implications of these anchor assumptions in terms of causality and what kinds of data are they most useful for. So with that, thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Gemma, for this very interesting talk. We'll take some questions from the audience, but perhaps this time I would like to start. So could you go back to the experiment slides in which you were changing the correlation between the latent factors, basically using and showing how VAE and beta VAE perform with respect to.
Oh, which one was it? Sorry, this one or?
So I think you had a slide in which you showed how the DCI metric.
Okay, yeah.
So, if I understand correctly, here you increase the correlation of the true factors, but you showed that that the sparse VAE performs well even as the factors stay correlated.
Yes.
So, in a way, like you are implying that this sparsity constraint can be useful also in the case where like we have non-independent latents, which I think seems particularly interesting for this workshop. So I wanted to ask you whether you like to comment on these. Like, so you think that basically this is the
Yeah. So that's a great question. So we see that our method still does well. It starts to get worse for like quite high levels of correlation between our factors. But our proof of identifiability actually allows for the factors to be correlated, but up to a certain point. And so that's what we wanted to investigate in those experiments of, okay, so we have this condition, how well does the method do as we gradually make this worse in terms of holding. So I guess the way that I think about it is that if you have this anchor assumption, then you have these noisy proxies of your latent variables in the observed data. And so as long as your two anchor features are more correlated with each other than like the other variables, then it doesn't matter if the other latent variables are also correlated with those, because you have these like strong proxies in your observed data that allows you to like identify them as long as they're not too correlated with the other anchor features corresponding to different factors. Did that help answer the question? Okay, cool.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very fascinating because like we are interested in factors which are I guess independent in this workshop.
Definitely, yeah. So it would be interesting to think more about. So in our experiments, actually, we just had an independent Gaussian prior on the Zs, and we found that like it still worked well when the Zs were correlated, but like actually learning that correlation matrix between the Zs would be super interesting and like relate to causal discovery. Like if we could do it all at once, then that would be super cool.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Okay. We will take any questions from the audience.
Thanks for the great talk. So since the introduction of the anchor feature assumption or anchor word assumption, there's like a line of work that relaxes this assumption for identifiability of general latent variable models. So I'm just curious if you have a sense of if you think for your approach that this anchor feature assumption is necessary, or if it could potentially be weakened to other types of conditions.
Yeah, so I guess I'm not sure what works you're referring to, but in like NMF, for example, there's a separability condition, whereas like as long as the anchor features are like separate enough, then you can identify them. So yeah, I think that, up to sort of those kinds of relaxations, it's still identifiable. My intuition is that there is some kind of necessary requirement, but I don't have like any proof or anything for that. I think that there's an interesting work just out on arXiv on sparse structure for the nonlinear ICA problem. So this paper here, and so it would be interesting to see like how that corresponds to an anchor assumption. So they consider when they have the same numbers of factors as features, and considering how that interacts with our work would be very interesting. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Did you consider other way to induce sparsity besides the spike and slab?
Yeah. So we also did some experiments looking at a version of the horseshoe to induce sparsity. The thing I like about the spike and slab setup is that you can threshold things exactly to 0 versus these other like global local sparsity priors that just like shrink things but don't set them exactly to 0. But yeah, I think that, you know, there are many different, you know, potentially like a gumball softmax thing, which would be interesting that we haven't investigated. Yeah, I just found that these spike and slab priors worked really well in this setting.
Thanks.
My question is, I am thinking how to bring this approach to causal discovery, for example. It is a question about your opinion. So I am wondering if you could use similar tools like these anchors to, instead of induce sparsity, induce some ordering of the latents to extract like a causal graph. So induce some causal ordering.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. My intuition is that you would need some kind of additional intervention information to be able to get at that like ordering, as various talks have mentioned today. I'm not sure how you could incorporate that intervention information directly and learn both at the same time. That would be a really interesting thing to do for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I think we will thank our speaker again.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of the workshop. Time to announce the Best Paper Awards. So these are sponsored by the UAI main conference and awarded with $250 each as cash prize. And the two papers that have been selected are Abstraction between Structural Causal Models, Review of Definitions and Properties by Fabio, Massimo, Zennaro, and Partial Disentanglement via Mechanism Sparsity by Sébastien Lachapelle and Simon Lacoste-Julien. So if you haven't already been contacted, the UAI chairs will reach out to you to arrange the transfer of the prize and award. Yeah, that concludes the afternoon session. We're now going to move on to the second and last poster session. We are running a bit behind on time, but we can go over the 6 p.m. deadline, as there is also going to be drinks from 6 p.m. onwards, shared with the other workshops, also at the same spot at the poster sessions. And then last but not least, let's maybe take the time again to thank all of our amazing speakers, as well as all of the authors of submitted papers, all of our reviewers, and the organizing team for what I hope was an interesting workshop, and hopefully we'll sort of still have some interesting discussions now at the poster session. So thanks for coming, everyone. Oh, and for the remote participants, there's of course also a parallel second poster session going on GatherTown.